Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands, November 1942. The nights on Guadalcanal were blacker than ink. Moonlight, when it came, filtered through a canopy of palm fronds and war smoke, barely touching the slick jungle floor. To the men of the 1st Marine Division dug into their foxholes around Henderson Field, night was not a time of rest, but of listening for footsteps, whispers, the slide of metal, or the thud of a grenade pin rolling loose. By late 1942, the Guadalcanal campaign had sunk into a brutal, grinding stalemate. The Marines held the airfield, barely, and the Japanese, desperate to take it back, had begun resorting to methods that blurred the line between soldier and phantom. Intelligence officers at Lunga Point called it unconventional warfare. The men in the foxholes had another word for it: haunting. The first reports came in mid-November, after the Battle of the Tenaru River and a string of failed Japanese assaults. Patrols began finding enemy uniforms stripped from fallen Americans, jackets, helmets, even boots taken from the dead. At first, it was assumed to be simple scavenging. Japanese soldiers were known to take what they could from corpses. But then the stories began circulating around the perimeter, stories that no one wanted to believe. Private First Class George Mills, a radio man from E Company, swore he heard an American voice shouting for help beyond the wire one night. "Sounded just like one of ours," he told his platoon sergeant. "Clear as day. Corpsman, I'm hit." Mills had crawled toward the voice, fumbling for his flashlight. He never found the source, but the next morning the wire was cut and 2 sentries were dead, throats slit. That morning, Captain William Bill Renner gathered his men in the mud outside the perimeter line. He was a cautious man, the kind whose calm voice carried weight. "Listen close," he told them, holding up a captured Japanese cap with a Marine emblem stitched crudely to the front. "They're wearing our gear now. Talking like us? Hell, some of them sound better than us. You hear someone in the dark? You challenge them first. 3 times. If they don't answer right, you shoot." Someone asked, "Sir, what if it is one of ours?" Renner's jaw tightened. Then God help us. It was later revealed, through captured documents and post-war interrogations, that these shadows were part of special infiltration units of the Imperial Japanese Army, drawn from elite reconnaissance and intelligence detachments. Some had studied English in universities before the war, others in merchant academies or missionary schools in Tokyo and Yokohama. A few had even lived abroad, clerks in Los Angeles, students in Sydney. They were trained to mimic everything: accents, slang, the rhythm of American speech. They carried captured Thompsons or Springfields and moved in small teams, slipping through the coconut groves between Marine outposts. Their task was simple: spread confusion, destroy communications, assassinate officers, and, when discovered, vanish into the jungle. At Henderson Field, the first real evidence came when Marines discovered a dead infiltrator wearing a stolen PFC uniform and carrying a handwritten list of American radio call signs. In his pocket was a folded movie ticket from San Francisco, perhaps a memento or a prop meant to sell the disguise. The intelligence officers who examined it later noted the neat penmanship and American idioms scrawled in a notebook beside it. "See you later, pal. Any smokes left? How's the chow?" The realization hit like a bullet. The enemy could now sound exactly like them. That December, the infiltration campaign reached its height. Marines began setting up password challenges at every point. 2 words changed nightly, chosen from a master list by divisional intelligence. But even those precautions sometimes failed. On December 14th, near the Matanikau River, a Marine patrol heard movement along the trail. "That you, Johnson?" someone whispered. "Yeah, it's me," came the reply. Perfect English, relaxed, almost casual. The patrol leader hesitated. "What's the password?" The voice laughed. "Hell, how should I know? It's me, Johnson." By the time they realized their mistake, Grenades were already rolling toward them. The next morning, they found the attackers' bodies. 3 Japanese soldiers dressed in marine fatigues, their pockets filled with Hershey wrappers and Lucky Strike tins scavenged from captured supply dumps. One had even taken the trouble to stitch a fake US flag patch on his sleeve. The discovery chilled everyone to the bone. Language, once the surest marker of friend or foe, had become useless. The men adapted as best they could. They developed new habits, asking obscure questions, calling for personal nicknames, using hand signals that only their platoons knew. But paranoia became as dangerous as the infiltrators themselves. On Christmas Eve, a Marine sentry shot one of his own, a corporal from another company, after mistaking his Australian accent for a ruse. The shot brought the whole camp awake, and by dawn, morale was at its lowest point since the campaign began. In the command post, General Alexander Vandergrift read the reports with a heavy heart. He understood the stakes. These infiltrations were not merely tactical, they were psychological. Every whisper in the dark, every misplaced step now carried the weight of suspicion. "Tell the men to hold fast," he told his staff. "If they want to play tricks with our language, we'll find a new way to talk." It was the beginning of the password evolution, a system that would later give birth to one of the most famous linguistic tests of the Pacific War. But on Guadalcanal it was still trial and error, still a battle fought as much with words as with bullets. That same night, in the humid dark near the Lunga perimeter, Private Mills, still haunted by that voice calling Corpsman, sat in his foxhole listening to the insects buzz. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy, thick with rot and cordite. Then, faintly, from beyond the line, he heard it again. "Corpsman! Over here! I'm hit! Please!" His hand trembled on the rifle. Every instinct screamed to go. He had lost 2 friends the same way. "Password!" he shouted hoarsely. The jungle went silent. Then the voice came back, quieter this time, pleading. "Corpsman, help!" Mills's finger tightened on the trigger. "Password!" Nothing. Only the whisper of leaves in the dark. He fired. The flash lit up the palms, and for a second he thought he saw movement, a figure in an American helmet falling silently backward. At dawn they found the body. It wasn't one of theirs. The uniform was American, the face unmistakably Japanese. A grenade pin still clung to his belt. Mills said nothing. He just stared at the corpse as the sun burned through the mist. The message spread through the division by midday. The shadows can speak like us, but they bleed like them. And from that day forward, the Marines' trust in the sound of their own language was gone. The war on Guadalcanal had entered a new phase, one fought in whispers, passwords, and fear of the voice calling from the dark. By the new year, the men of the 1st Marine Division had grown gaunt, hollow-eyed, and hard. Guadalcanal had burned the softness out of them. The jungle was a furnace of insects and disease, the nights a theatre of whispers and gunfire. The Japanese infiltration attempts had grown bolder, almost theatrical. English-speaking voices called across the darkness with uncanny precision. "Hey, Mac! Light up a smoke! Sergeant says fall back," but every syllable dripped with hidden intent. The Marines had learned to distrust everything, even the sound of their own names. The first real turning point came in early January, when a Marine linguist named Lieutenant Frank Red McCarthy arrived on the island. McCarthy was a Boston schoolteacher before the war, fluent in Japanese from his time teaching English in Yokohama in the 1930s. He'd seen the rise of imperial militarism up close, and he knew something others didn't. The Japanese could mimic English, but they couldn't feel it. He joined the intelligence team at Henderson Field, reviewing reports of infiltration. The evidence was grim, raids that started with friendly words, then erupted in chaos. He read Mills's report about the Corpsman incident 3 times. Then he leaned back in his chair and murmured, We need a word they can't wear like a mask. The challenge was linguistic. The Japanese infiltrators had strong command of grammar and vocabulary, but English phonetics were their Achilles heel. Sounds like R, L, TH and certain vowel blends were notoriously difficult for native Japanese speakers to pronounce authentically under stress. So McCarthy proposed an idea, one part language trap, one part psychological weapon, a test word so distinct in American sound and rhythm that no imposter could get it right. He called it the Lollapalooza test. The term Lollapalooza was an old Americanism, slang from the early 1900s, meaning something exceptional or outlandish. It rolled off American tongues with lazy ease, the double L, the open vowels, the casual swing of confidence. To anyone not born and steeped in English's peculiar rhythm, it was a tongue-twister. McCarthy pitched the idea to General Vandergrift's staff during a humid morning briefing inside a tent lined with damp maps. "We've tried simple passwords," McCarthy said, pointing to the chalkboard. "They fail because they're predictable. Apple pie, freedom, baseball. The infiltrators have learned those. They can pronounce them. But this," he underlined the word Lollapalooza. "This is a carnival of consonants. You can't fake it without tripping over your tongue." Some officers laughed. One said, "You expect a jarhead at 2 a.m. in the rain to say Lollapalooza with a straight face." McCarthy smiled. "He won't need to. He just needs to know the real thing when he hears it." Within days, Lollapalooza became the new perimeter challenge word around Henderson Field and the Matanikau sector. The code system was simple. One Marine would call "Flash," the other would respond with "Thunder," then immediately follow with "Lollapalooza." The absurdity of it broke tension at first. Men joked about it in the mess line. "What genius thought that up?" they'd mutter, laughing through exhaustion. But when night came and the jungle swallowed the sound of the surf, no one laughed anymore. On the night of January 10th, the test word earned its place in legend. At 0200 hours near the western perimeter, a 4-man Marine fire team heard movement along the trail. The sentry called, "Flash!" There was a pause, then a calm voice replied from the darkness, "Thunder!" The sentry's pulse quickened. So far, so good. "Say the word," he barked. The voice hesitated, then uncertainly, "Lollapalooza." The Marine didn't wait. "Open fire!" The jungle erupted with gunfire and grenades. When dawn came, they found 3 Japanese infiltrators dead, dressed in American uniforms. Each had been carrying wire cutters and grenades taped for silent handling. The test had worked. From then on, Lollapalooza wasn't just a password. It was a lifeline. Reports from the 1st Marine Division's intelligence section noted a sharp decline in successful infiltration attempts by mid-January. The Japanese, confused and demoralized, began avoiding direct linguistic contact. Post-war interrogations of captured soldiers from the 38th Infantry Regiment later confirmed it. The Americans began using strange words that made no sense, one officer recalled. "We could not imitate them." We did not understand why they laughed when they said them, but for the Marines, the laughter had meaning. It was the laughter of survival. Corporal Raymond "Shorty" Dugan remembered his first time using the word in combat. He was on outpost duty, sweating through his uniform, the jungle alive with insects and fear. "Flash!" he called out. "Thunder!" came the reply. Then Dugan shouted, "Say it!" A long pause. Then, clear and steady, "Lollapalooza." He exhaled. "All right, you're good." The other Marine stepped into view, mud-caked, bone-tired, grinning. "Can't believe I just said that word in a war," he said. Dugan chuckled. "Hell of a thing to die over, huh?" The laughter that followed was brief, but it broke something heavy in the air. For once, words had saved lives instead of taking them. The Japanese infiltration campaign on Guadalcanal effectively ended by February 1943, as the Imperial Army began withdrawing its forces under relentless American air and naval pressure. But the psychological scars lingered. For months afterward, Marines in other Pacific campaigns, on New Georgia, Bougainville, and later Peleliu, continued to use absurd, phonetic-heavy words as improvised identity checks. Lollapalooza became a catchphrase, a linguistic talisman whispered with a mix of mockery and reverence. In one after-action report filed by the 13th Fighter Command, a pilot described overhearing ground troops shouting it during a nighttime perimeter alarm. "I thought they were drunk until I learned it was a code. Best damn password I ever heard." Decades later, at a 1985 Pacific Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, an aging Marine named Dugan told the story again to a small crowd of grey-haired men. "That word saved my hide more than once," he said, his voice raspy with age. "It sounded ridiculous then, and it still does, but it worked because it was ours." You couldn't fake being American if you couldn't say it. Someone in the audience laughed softly. "Say it again for old time's sake." Dugan grinned, raised his glass, and spoke the word that had turned a war of shadows back into one of flesh and blood. "Lollapalooza." The room fell quiet, and for a moment the ghosts of Guadalcanal seemed to stir, men listening in the dark, waiting for a voice to say it right. By the time the moon rose over the steaming palms, Guadalcanal had become a battlefield of sound. Every rustle was a threat, every whisper a test of nerves. The men of the 1st Marine Division had learned to measure life in syllables. Flash, thunder, Lollapalooza. 3 words that could mean safety or death. The Japanese, unwilling to abandon their tactic, adapted in turn. Survivors of failed infiltration teams passed along warnings. The Americans have a strange code. We must listen before we speak, so they grew quieter. Shadows with rifles, moving through the kunai grass and banyan roots, searching for weak spots in the perimeter. But what they didn't know was that the Marines were listening too. The intelligence section at Henderson Field had begun intercepting fragments of captured Japanese diaries. Many contained notes about the English test, or the word of confusion. One fragment, taken from a fallen Japanese NCO near the Tenaru River, read, "They have a password that sounds like nonsense. Our men cannot repeat it. Their tongues twist and betray them." To Lieutenant Frank McCarthy, the man who had conceived the Lollapalooza test, it was proof of concept. The enemy had turned his invention into folklore. But it also worried him. The longer a word was used, the greater the risk of compromise. The Japanese might not be able to say it, but they could still learn it. At dusk, McCarthy met with Colonel Robert Hall of the 2nd Marine Regiment in a sandbagged tent lit by lantern glow. "They're adapting," McCarthy said, his voice tight with exhaustion. "They know we're testing for pronunciation. We might need a second tier. Something unpredictable." Hall exhaled, rubbing his temples. "You want to change the password again? Half my men barely remember the first one." "I'm not talking about a replacement," McCarthy said. "I'm talking about escalation." He pulled a notebook from his breast pocket. Inside were sketches, phonetic traps, slang words, idioms impossible for non-native speakers to master under duress. "They can fake grammar," McCarthy explained, "but not instinct. Americans use rhythm, idiom, exaggeration. It's in how we talk. We could use that." Hall smirked faintly. "So, you want my men to start quoting baseball scores and movie lines?" "If it keeps them alive," McCarthy said. "Why not?" Meanwhile, out at the front lines near the Lunga River, word of the Japanese English ghosts had spread. Men began improvising their own verbal traps. One platoon used Coca-Cola as a test word. Another demanded the answer to "Who's the babe?" expecting Ruth as the reply. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Private Jack Tillman recalled one eerie night when the system nearly failed. We heard footsteps in the dark, real close. So I called, "Flash," and a voice said, "Thunder." Right back, just perfect. I thought it was one of ours. Then I said, "Lollapalooza," and he paused, only for a second, then said, "Roar pa." That was enough. They opened fire. In the morning, they found the infiltrator sprawled in the mud, still clutching a stolen marine carbine. On his uniform pocket was a blood-stained phrasebook. Common American words. Practice set 3. Tillman stared at it for a long time before muttering, "Guess he didn't make it to set 4. For the Japanese, the growing futility of the infiltration campaign became clear by late January. Captain Kenji Muto, a communications officer captured during the evacuation of Guadalcanal, later told Allied interrogators, "We studied your language from movies and schools, but we did not know its music." The Americans spoke with rhythm, like drums. When we imitated them, something always betrayed us. His words would later be quoted in the 1962 U.S.-Japanese Aviation History Symposium as an example of how cultural nuance became a weapon of war. Back on the island, the Marines found dark humour in their situation. To them, Guadalcanal was no longer just a battleground. It was a test of sanity. Rain turned foxholes into pits of mud. The stench of rot and cordite hung over everything. Yet amid it all, they clung to language as a lifeline. "Words are all we got left," Sergeant Dugan told his squad one night as they crouched by the perimeter wire. "The Japs got their tricks, we got ours. And ours sound funnier." Someone laughed. "You think they're out there practicing Lollapalooza right now?" "Let 'em try," Dugan said. "Ain't a word you can learn. It's a word you gotta feel." That night, around 0300, a patrol returned from a recon sweep along the Tenaru. They reported hearing faint English voices in the jungle. 2, maybe 3. "Sounded like they were arguing," said the patrol leader. "Corporal says we move left," one of them said. "Only problem was, we didn't have a corporal out there." The Marines held fire, listening. Then came a single word, shouted in desperation, "Corpsman!" Every man froze. Dugan whispered, "Don't move! Don't answer!" Then the voice came again, closer now. "Corpsman! He's hit bad." A moment later, a faint crack in the underbrush. The sound of a rifle bolt. "Lollapalooza!" Dugan whispered into the dark. Nothing. The squad fired into the trees. When the smoke cleared, they found 3 enemy dead. One dressed in marine khakis, another wearing a stolen helmet marked with a red cross. Dugan crouched beside the body. Guess he didn't pass the test. By February 1943, the Guadalcanal campaign was nearing its bloody end. But the story of the Lollapalooza test spread far beyond the island. It reached the 2nd Marine Division in Tarawa, then the 5th at Peleliu, then the 3rd on Guam. Soon, absurd, tongue-twisting passwords became a Marine tradition, living proof that even in war, the most powerful weapon could be a word only home could teach you how to say. The fighting on Guadalcanal was drawing to a close, but for Lieutenant Frank McCarthy, the war of words was only beginning. He stood in the dim light of a field tent that smelled of mildew and paper, sorting through captured Japanese documents, each one a testament to a strange new kind of warfare, one fought not only with bullets but with language itself. Stacks of tattered notebooks sat on his cot. Each bore phonetic scribbles in careful Japanese characters. "Corpsman. Hands up. Don't shoot." Some even had attempts at jokes. "How's tricks, buddy?" Phrases plucked from overheard conversations, now stripped of meaning. McCarthy ran his finger down the pages, feeling both awe and unease. "They weren't just fighting us," he said quietly to a Navy intelligence officer beside him. "They were studying us." In Washington, the Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI, had already begun compiling reports about Japanese infiltration tactics. The Guadalcanal incidents became case studies in the emerging discipline of psycholinguistics, how language reflected identity, culture, and trust. A memo dated March 1, 1943, read, "Enemy infiltration attempts utilizing English disguise have proven increasingly sophisticated. Countermeasures relying on phonetic irregularities, notably the Lollapalooza test, have demonstrated remarkable efficacy. Recommend continued research into linguistic deception and recognition protocols." It was the first time in US military history that a word had been classified as a tactical weapon. By the time McCarthy left Guadalcanal, he was emaciated and pale, but his idea had become doctrine. The Navy officially incorporated irregular linguistic countersigns into its Pacific Theater Field manuals, noting that unpredictable phonetics could defeat enemy impersonation attempts more effectively than any visual test. At a debrief in Noumea, McCarthy presented his findings to a circle of officers and linguists from the newly formed Joint Intelligence Center, Pacific Ocean Areas, JICPOA. He spoke without notes. "Language is the truest uniform," he said. "A soldier can fake a patch, a rank, a salute, but not the rhythm of his own culture. The Japanese failed because they spoke English like a code. We spoke it like a heartbeat." One officer asked, "You think this'll work anywhere else? Burma, maybe? Europe?" McCarthy smiled faintly. "Anywhere humans listen before they shoot." Back on Guadalcanal, the Marines who had survived the campaign were boarding transports for rest and refit. Among them was Sergeant Raymond Shorty Dugan, who carried home more than scars. He'd seen the Lollapalooza test work firsthand, and it had saved men he cared about. Years later, Dugan would recall that winter in an oral history for the National World War II Museum. "It wasn't just about the word. It was what it meant. You had to be from somewhere to say it right, had to have sat in a diner, listened to a ball game, heard your old man swear at the radio. It was America in one crazy word. For the men who'd lived through Guadalcanal's jungle nightmare, that was enough." Meanwhile, Japanese officers who survived the campaign were interrogated at Rabaul and later in Tokyo. Lieutenant Satoru Nakayama of the 38th Infantry Regiment described his unit's infiltration efforts. "We learned English from captured newspapers and phonograph records. We practiced with each other. But the Americans changed their words too quickly. They used nonsense phrases that had no logic. We could not predict them." Nakayama's statement confirmed what McCarthy had theorized, that unpredictability, not complexity, was the key to linguistic security. In later intelligence summaries, Allied translators called it the Lollapalooza effect, a phenomenon where cultural intuition trumped learned skill. By mid-1943, the Lollapalooza test had spread across the Pacific. U.S. Army units on New Guinea and Bougainville were instructed to use password irregularity drills. Some chose equally absurd countersigns: Oklahoma, Jeepers, Shenanigan, and Hot Dog. In one report from the 25th Infantry Division, a sentry described halting a suspected infiltrator near Munda Point. "He answered all my questions perfectly until I asked him to say shenanigan. He froze. Then he said, Shenarigan. That was all I needed." The incident made its way into JICPOA's internal bulletin under the heading Field Application of Linguistic Challenge. For McCarthy, it was validation, but also a reminder of something darker. In the spring of 1943, he was reassigned to Oahu to train new intelligence officers in linguistic analysis. His lectures mixed psychology and phonetics, but behind the academic tone lay a moral weight. He told his students, "We didn't win because they were less clever. We won because we understood what makes a person sound real. Never forget that. The moment you lose your language, you lose your home." He paused, tapping the chalkboard where he'd written the word that had followed him from the jungle. Lollapalooza. Decades later, when McCarthy was an old man, a journalist from Stars and Stripes interviewed him for a retrospective on strange wartime inventions. The reporter asked if he still believed one silly word had made a difference in the Pacific. McCarthy laughed softly. A silly word saved hundreds of lives. It reminded us that war isn't just about steel or fire. It's about who we are when the lights go out and a voice in the dark says, "Who's there?" He paused, eyes distant. And you know what? I still make my grandkids say it, just to see if they can. By January 1943, Guadalcanal was a graveyard of hopes. The jungle reeked of rot and cordite, the airstrips were patched with crushed coral, and every man alive had seen someone he knew die within arm's reach. But among the sleepless Marines around Henderson Field, something darker than exhaustion had set in. Paranoia. They were no longer just fighting a visible enemy. The Japanese were inside their minds, their language, even their foxholes. It had been weeks since the first confirmed infiltration. Japanese soldiers, fluent in English, had slipped past sentries, speaking like Americans, calling out in accents good enough to fool even veterans from New York or California. The attacks were brutal and brief. A knife in the dark, a grenade into a tent, a burst from a captured Thompson submachine gun. The confusion ran so deep that the Marines had shot at their own out of reflex. That's when headquarters finally decided something had to change. In a tent near the airfield's edge, under flickering lanterns, a small group of officers gathered around a table stacked with casualty lists and intercepted notes. Captain Edwin Red Tully of the 164th Infantry tapped the butt of his pencil against a dispatch form. Every night they're slipping through. They know the layout, the passwords, even our slang. We change the countersign every evening and they still nail it. Captain Bill McCloskey from the 1st Marines scowled. They've probably got a guy in one of our comm tents. Hell, half of them sound like they've been to San Diego. Across the table, Lieutenant Alan Tex Fenton leaned forward. We've been using simple countersigns, things they could have picked up from prisoners, radios, or even magazines. We need something they can't fake, something they can't pronounce. There was a pause. McCloskey frowned. Like what? Fenton grinned. A word they wouldn't even know existed. That's when Sergeant First Class Joe Parks, a wiry Midwesterner with a pack of Lucky Strikes tucked in his sleeve, muttered, "How about Lollapalooza?" The room turned to him. "Lolla what?" Tully said. "Lollapalooza," Parks repeated. "Heard it at the county fair back home. Means something big, wild, over the top. Nobody says it but Americans. Bet your boots the Japs never heard it." There was laughter at first, the kind that came from sheer fatigue. But the word stuck. It was perfect in its absurdity. Long, awkward, hard to say fast, and unmistakably American. By midnight, the new password was in effect. Challenge, Lolla. Reply, Palooza. The men at the perimeter dug in tighter than ever. Foxholes faced the jungle, fingers resting on triggers, and every shadow seemed to shift. When the wind carried the rustle of palm fronds, someone would whisper the challenge word. Lolla? And wait for the answering syllables in the dark. The first test came just after 2 a.m. A patrol from Easy Company was returning from the Matanikau River. Rain had turned the ground to black mud. The moon was swallowed by clouds, and visibility was nil. Corporal Vince Ramirez, leading the perimeter post, heard shuffling near the tree line. He called softly, "Lolla?" A pause. Then a voice, too clear, too careful, answered, "Lorry? Palu?" The M1 rifles erupted. The jungle flashed white with gunfire, the echoes rolling back like thunder. When the shooting stopped, 3 figures lay tangled in the brush, all Japanese, wearing US uniforms, one still clutching a captured Garand. None of them had gotten the word right. By dawn, the word had spread through every squad on the island. Lollapalooza became more than a countersign. It became a kind of grim inside joke, a talisman against confusion. Men scrawled it on helmets, muttered it under their breath, even carved it into mess tables. "Lollapalooza," one Marine quipped, "is the only thing keeping us from killing each other." The effect was immediate. Reports of infiltration dropped. The Japanese, still attempting to slip through the lines, were tripped up by the impossible word, its double L's, rolling vowels, and peculiar rhythm. Some tried to imitate it, others stayed silent and were shot before they could think twice. But the incident also revealed something else: how language itself had become a weapon of war. Captured Japanese prisoners later told interrogators that the infiltration units had studied American speech using captured movies and phonograph records. Some had even memorized slang from old Life magazines. Yet, as one captured sergeant admitted through an interpreter, there were sounds we could not make, words that twisted the tongue, like that one, the one you used. By the third week of January, Henderson Field was holding. The infiltration attempts dwindled as the Japanese began preparing for withdrawal. Still, the men who had fought through those weeks would never forget the feeling of hearing their own language turned against them, of realizing that trust had become as fragile as the flicker of a lantern in the rain. On the night the final Japanese counterattack broke against the Marine perimeter, the challenge was whispered again and again down the line. "Lollapalooza!" It passed like a heartbeat, word to word, foxhole to foxhole, a chain of sound binding tired men together in the dark. At dawn, the jungle fell silent. Henderson's strip shimmered under the new light. The infiltrators were gone. But for years afterward, veterans of Guadalcanal would grin at reunions, raise a glass, and murmur that one word, strange, silly, and sacred, that had once drawn the line between life and death. Lollapalooza. By February 1943, Guadalcanal was all but secured, yet the fear of voices in the night lingered like a fever that would not break. Men still woke at every shout, every cry for Corpsman, echoing through the palms. Even when the Japanese had been driven into the jungle's interior, rumours persisted that they were still among them, still wearing US fatigues, still speaking in perfect, haunting English. The story of Lollapalooza had spread far beyond Henderson Field. Reports of similar infiltration attempts had surfaced across the Pacific, in the Solomons, in New Guinea, and even among Navy shore detachments on small islands. The idea that the enemy could sound like your friend terrified every man who held a rifle. Major Thomas "Tommy" Griggs, a communications officer for the 13th Fighter Command, was assigned to investigate the phenomenon. His orders were simple: confirm whether Japanese forces still employed English-speaking infiltrators and, if possible, understand how they had learned the language so well. He began at Henderson's Field Hospital, where wounded Marines still recounted strange encounters. Private Harold "Red" Madsen, pale beneath bandages, described one night's horror in a low voice. "He called out like one of ours, said he was hit. We ran toward him, 2 of us. When we got close, I saw he had a Thompson, but the sling was wrong side. I shouted, 'Where you from?' He said, 'Philly.' Sounded perfect. Then he dropped a grenade at his own feet." Griggs wrote every detail. Another Marine, Lance Corporal Wiggins, added, "They'd yell names too. Real names, like they'd been listening to roll call. You'd hear your buddy's name shouted from the jungle. You'd answer before you even thought." By the time Griggs returned to his tent that night, the weight of what he'd heard pressed on him like the heat itself. He began cross-referencing captured Japanese documents, hoping for patterns, lists of phrases, phonetic notes, or guides to US military slang. To his surprise, he found them. In a captured rucksack recovered from the Matanikau sector was a water-stained notebook labelled Eigo Kyoshu, English Lessons. Inside were crude phonetic spellings of words like "Okay, buddy," "Cover me," "Corpsman," and "Where's Chow?" the everyday rhythm of Marine speech. But there were also phrases like, "Hold fire, friendly," "Don't shoot, it's me," and "Medic down." Griggs realised then these infiltrators weren't just improvising. They'd been trained. Days later, he tracked down Sergeant Joe Parks, the man who had first coined Lollapalooza. Parks was leaner now, sunburned and hollow-eyed, but his humour was intact. "Hell, Major," he said, lighting a cigarette. "That word saved my ass more times than my helmet." Griggs asked if he'd seen any more infiltrators since January. "Not alive," Parks said. "But we found one after the last push, wearing a Yank jacket, carrying a US-45, and a movie ticket stub from Los Angeles. Turns out he'd worked on a freighter before the war, picked up English in port bars. They said he could sing Bing Crosby without a damn accent." That detail shook Griggs more than anything. This wasn't just mimicry, it was cultural memory turned lethal. These men had lived among Americans once, laughed with them, traded with them, then turned those very words into weapons. Back at 13th Fighter Command HQ, Griggs filed his report under the title Enemy Linguistic Mimicry, Guadalcanal Case Study. His conclusion read, "Language, when weaponized, can breach any line. The countermeasure is not linguistic superiority, but unpredictability. The insertion of absurdity, novelty, or cultural specificity beyond the enemy's reach. In simpler terms, use words they could never practice. Slang born of humour, not textbooks." Lollapalooza had worked precisely because it was nonsensical, alive, American to its core. Yet even as the front shifted northward toward Bougainville, the paranoia endured. Men no longer trusted voices in the dark. They invented new tests, singing half a verse of Yankee Doodle, asking baseball questions, who won the 1939 series, or demanding quick local slang from stateside regions. Each night became a linguistic duel, word against word, accent against accent, fought in whispers over coral and mud. When Griggs finally left Guadalcanal, he took one souvenir, a faded slip of paper bearing the scribbled countersign, Lollapalooza. He tucked it into his flight jacket, where it remained through the next 2 years of island-hopping war. In later campaigns, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, the same trick would be passed along, sometimes as Poughkeepsie, sometimes razzmatazz, always something impossible to fake. But those who had been there first, in that wet jungle in 42, knew where it had started, a word too strange for the enemy tongue, a word that drew the line between ally and assassin. And so, when Guadalcanal veterans reunited years later, someone would always say it, half in jest, half in reverence. "Lolla?" one would whisper. "Palooza," came the reply. Laughter would follow, not loud, but steady. The kind born not of amusement, but relief, that somehow, against the darkness, they had found one word that could still keep them alive. The war moved on, but Guadalcanal's ghosts followed. By 1944, the island had become a rear area base, its jungles cleared, its airfields busy with supply flights bound for Bougainville and the Marianas. Yet the veterans who stayed behind still jumped at every misplaced voice. The infiltration scare had hardened into doctrine. Every US unit in the South Pacific received a new directive from Admiral Halsey's headquarters. All personnel will verify identity by daily countersign. Countersign to change at dusk. The language test born from fear was now official Navy policy, but the reports never stopped entirely. On small atolls, New Georgia, Colombangara, Rendova, sentries swore they still heard American voices drifting through the palms. Sometimes it was a word or two, sometimes an entire sentence. "Need ammo," or "Corpsman," followed by silence. Whether those were Japanese infiltrators, echoes, or just memory playing tricks on exhausted men, no one could say. Yet every Marine knew someone who'd answered and never come back. In mid-1944, Major Tommy Griggs was reassigned to the Joint Intelligence Center, Pacific Ocean Areas, JICPOA, in Honolulu. His Guadalcanal report on linguistic deception had made its way up the chain, and now he found himself working beside linguists, psychologists, and codebreakers, men who saw words as weapons. One day, a Japanese document arrived from the Philippines, captured by U.S. Rangers. It was labelled Special Warfare Curriculum, Section 9, Foreign Phrases and Idioms. Inside were lists of colloquial English expressions, neatly transcribed in katakana. Some were awkward, hot as a frying dog, others nearly perfect. "Take cover, boys." The attached note chilled Griggs. Evidence indicates Japanese military schools in Formosa and Hainan trained select NCOs in American English, using pre-war film reels and phonograph recordings. They had studied Hollywood dialogue, Clark Gable, James Cagney, even Humphrey Bogart, learning rhythm, slang and accent from celluloid ghosts. But it had limits. Their English was fixed in time, frozen in the 1930s. Language, Griggs realized, evolved too fast to counterfeit completely. Every new slang word born in the mud, boondocks, chowhound, scuttlebutt, was another layer of armor. By late 1944, the Lollapalooza test had become legendary. A Navy training manual even cited it, unofficially, under the heading Improvised Countersign Recognition. It read, "Enemy infiltrators have imitated friendly speech. In one instance, an American word of absurd origin successfully prevented penetration. Let ingenuity, not routine, guard your post." At the 1st Marine Division's reunion years later, Joe Parks would recall that line and laugh. "Absurd origin," he said. "That's us in a nutshell." The last confirmed case of a Japanese English-speaking infiltrator came on Peleliu in September 1944. He'd been captured alive after shouting for a medic in flawless Midwestern English. Under interrogation, the man, Petty Officer Kiyoshi Murata, confessed he'd worked as a merchant seaman out of Seattle before the war. "I loved America," he told his captors, weeping, "but duty is duty. I thought if I sounded like you, maybe you'd hesitate. Maybe I could live 1 second longer." When Griggs read the transcript months later, he sat in silence. War, he thought, was a mirror, each side reflecting the other's humanity until neither could tell whose voice was whose. After VJ Day, Griggs returned home to Indiana. He carried one trunk of papers, reports, maps, and that single folded slip from Guadalcanal. On the back of the countersign, he wrote in pencil, "Language saves as much as it kills." He never published his findings, but his field notes were later archived at the Air Force Historical Research Agency. There, among combat records and codebooks, sits a small envelope marked Lollapalooza, Guadalcanal, 1942. Inside lies one word, nonsense to anyone else, but to those who survived the jungle nights, it was everything. A password, a promise, and a memory of the moment when sound itself became a weapon, and the human voice, both friend and foe, decided who would live to see the dawn. The Pacific War ended, but Lollapalooza didn't. It slipped from the palms of Guadalcanal into the language of every outpost, briefing, and bar. The nonsense word that once saved lives became legend, whispered with a grin by men who had seen too much to take passwords lightly. At Camp Pendleton in early 1946, newly enlisted Marines listened to a grizzled instructor recount the story. "They tried to talk like us," he said, pacing before the recruits. "But they didn't know what Lollapalooza meant. Hell, none of us did either. That's the point. It wasn't in their textbooks." The class laughed, but the lesson was serious. The war had proven that words were as deadly as bullets when used with precision. Counterintelligence officers cited the Guadalcanal infiltrations in lectures on linguistic warfare, how speech patterns, slang, and even regional rhythm could expose an enemy spy. At the same time, post-war analysts in Washington began examining how the Japanese had become so fluent. the Office of Naval Intelligence declassified a trove of captured documents, English phrasebooks printed in Tokyo in 1941, phonetic manuals for naval interpreters, even film scripts used in language schools. One report, dated December 1945, summarized the phenomenon succinctly. The Japanese emphasis on linguistic mimicry reveals an understanding that war in the modern age extends beyond the physical battlefield. The infiltration at Guadalcanal represents not only tactical deception, but psychological warfare through speech. Across the Pacific, another man remembered those same nights. Former Imperial Army interpreter Lieutenant Kenji Sato, repatriated to Osaka after internment, was interviewed by Allied authorities in 1946. When asked about the English-speaking infiltrators, he replied quietly, "They were told to become invisible, to speak like the Americans, so that for a few minutes the jungle would not know who it belonged to." Sato described how recruits were drilled using American newsreels and popular songs. "We learned rhythm from music, Yankee Doodle, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. Some men could copy the sound perfectly, but they did not know the heart behind the words. That, he said, was their undoing. When they heard laughter or slang, they hesitated. The Americans laughed even in battle. We never trained for that." Back in the United States, Major Tommy Griggs, now working as a linguistics instructor at Quantico, turned his wartime experience into a course called Language and Deception. His students were young, eager, and armed with notebooks instead of rifles. He began every lecture with a story about the night he first heard an American voice call "Corpsman" from the jungle, and what it cost to learn never to trust sound alone. He would write on the chalkboard, "Words are weapons, pronunciation can kill." Then he'd circle one word, Lollapalooza, and let the silence hang. "Gentlemen," he'd say, "it wasn't the word that mattered. It was knowing who could say it right." In 1952, a journalist for the Saturday Evening Post tracked down several Guadalcanal veterans for a feature titled "The Password That Fooled the Emperor." Sergeant Joe Parks, now a Chicago fireman, was quoted saying, "It was the dumbest word I ever heard, but when I said it, I was alive. That's all that counted." The article sparked letters from veterans across the country. Some claimed to have used Lollapalooza in the Solomons, others in New Guinea or the Philippines, memory mixing with myth. But the truth remained the same. The word had once separated life from death, English from imitation, trust from terror. Years later, during the Vietnam War, a Marine officer stationed near Da Nang kept a copy of Griggs's report pinned above his desk. On it, a single underlined phrase read, "Never assume a familiar voice is a friendly one." He told his men the story one humid evening, about shadows in uniform and a word that once drew the line between the living and the lost. When the night grew quiet, a private asked softly, "Sir, what's a Lollapalooza anyway?" The officer smiled faintly. "It's nothing," he said. "That's why it worked." And in the darkness, among the hum of radios and the soft rustle of the jungle, the word that outlived the war became what it had always been, a symbol of survival, of wit against fear, and of how a single sound could save an army. By the early 1960s, Guadalcanal was quiet again. The jungle had reclaimed the airfields and the rusting hulks that once symbolized life and death. Yet, among historians, the island's strange chapter of linguistic warfare remained a case study in the limits of human recognition, how a familiar sound could become the most dangerous weapon of all. At the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, the phenomenon had entered the curriculum under Psychological Counterintelligence, Case Study, Guadalcanal, 1942. Professors quoted Major Griggs' debriefing notes verbatim. "Words are not neutral. They can disarm or deceive faster than bullets." Younger officers, raised on radar and radio, found the story almost quaint. The idea of testing friend from foe with a word like Lollapalooza seemed absurd in the age of codebooks and secure channels. But the veterans in the room knew better. They remembered the chaos of a jungle night, the power of a human voice in the dark. In 1962, during a joint US-Japanese historical symposium in Tokyo, the topic resurfaced unexpectedly. A retired Japanese naval intelligence officer named Commander Masao Fujimura presented a paper titled On the Failure of Infiltration Linguistics. He began bluntly, "We underestimated the living nature of language." Fujimura explained how his wartime division had compiled thousands of English idioms from Hollywood films, newsreels, and even Reader's Digest. Their goal, to create linguistic camouflage. But once Japanese soldiers used those words in the field, the illusion broke apart. Accents drifted, pronunciations faltered. Words learned in classrooms lacked the tone of men speaking under fire. Then he smiled faintly and said, "Your people chose a countersign no dictionary could explain." That, gentlemen, was genius, or luck. Across the room, an American delegate recognized the term immediately, Lollapalooza. The audience laughed softly, but the underlying point was grave. War had entered an age where knowing the enemy's language wasn't enough. You had to know his rhythm, his humour, even his nonsense. In that same year, Griggs, now grey-haired and retired, received a letter from a Marine he had once trained. The young officer was serving in Laos, part of an advisory mission in the rising shadow of another jungle war. He wrote, "Sir, we have our own countersigns out here. Sometimes I think of Guadalcanal, of how men used a word that didn't mean anything, and it saved them. We still do the same thing, not with Lollapalooza, but with the sound of laughter, or a curse, or how we say a name. That's how we know who's real." Griggs placed the letter in a folder labelled Continuity of Language Doctrine. He never replied, but in his notes he wrote, "The war never ended, only the vocabulary changed." By the 1970s, as the Pacific veterans aged, Lollapalooza had drifted from countersign to folklore. It appeared in documentaries, novels, and even Marine Corps newsletters. Historians debated its origin. Some called it apocryphal, others insisted it was recorded in patrol logs. Then, in 1985, at the Pacific Theatre Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, the surviving men of the 1st Marine Division gathered under a canvas tent. A brass band played softly. When a reporter asked what word best summed up their time on Guadalcanal, old Sergeant Joe Parks chuckled through his oxygen mask. "Lollapalooza," he said, the syllables slow but sure. "That word's got more ghosts in it than any monument." The men around him nodded. They remembered how it sounded in the night, absurd, misplaced, and utterly human. In the archives today, researchers still find fragments. Radio logs marked countersign verified, interrogation transcripts, and psychological analyses of verbal deception. Most mention the same thing, fear of voices that sounded American. But only one file, handwritten and yellowed, carries the final annotation from Griggs himself. "In a war fought with guns and machines, we learned that language was our truest battlefield. The enemy spoke our words, but not our soul. That was the difference, and the victory." And so, in the quiet that followed, the word faded from military use, but never from memory. For those who once listened to the dark, Lollapalooza would forever mean one thing: the sound of survival when every other word had failed.